The rain hammered against the shutters of the stone cottage with such fury that Quinton Quade almost didn't hear the collapse outside. But the sound of splintering would cut through even the storm's rage, and he grabbed his lantern before his mind could catch up with his instincts. He threw open the door to a scene of chaos. His newly repaired fence lay in ruins, and crouched among the broken boards was a figure he recognized immediately as an orc. Though this one was smaller than the raiders who occasionally plagued the borderlands, her green skin slick with rain and mud, her dark hair plastered to her skull, as she struggled to free her leg from the twisted wreckage. Quinton should have grabbed his crossbow. Every sensible frontier farmer would have. Instead, he set down the lantern on the covered porch and stepped into the downpour, his boots immediately sinking into the churned mud. The orc girl's head snapped toward him, and he saw the flash of small tusks as her lips pulled back in what might have been fear or defiance, her amber eyes reflecting the lamplight like an animal's. "Easy," he said, raising his hand slowly. "You're caught." She said nothing, just watched him with that unblinking stare as he approached the ruined fence. Up close, he could see she was young, probably no older than 20, and desperately thin beneath the rough leather and hide she wore. Her leg was wedged between two boards that had twisted when the fence collapsed, and from the awkward angle, he suspected she'd been trying to climb over rather than through. "I'm going to pull these apart," Quinton said, keeping his voice level. "When I do, move back quick. Understood?" The orc girl's jaw worked, and for a moment he thought she might refuse to acknowledge him at all. Then she gave a single, sharp nod. Quinton gripped the two boards, braced his foot against the post, and pulled. The waterlogged wood resisted, then gave with a groan, and the orc girl yanked her leg free and scrambled backward so fast she nearly fell. She got her feet under her in a crouch, one hand braced on the mud, ready to bolt. That was when Quinton saw the blood. It ran down her calf in dark rivulets that the rain couldn't quite wash away, and her breathing came in short, painful gasps that had nothing to do with exertion. She was hurt, and badly, though whether from the fence or something earlier he couldn't tell. "You need that seen to," he said. "I will go." Her voice was rough, like she didn't use it often, and heavily accented in a way that made the common tongue sound harsher than it was. "I did not mean to damage your property. In this storm, you'll be dead by morning." Quinton straightened, water running down his face, and made a decision that his neighbors would call madness. "Come inside, I'll look at the leg." The orc girl stared at him as if he'd spoken in a language she didn't know. "You offer shelter." "I'm offering to keep you from bleeding out in my field," Quinton said. "Whether you take it is your choice." For a long moment, she didn't move. Then, slowly, she pushed herself upright, and he could see the effort it cost her not to favor the injured leg. She followed him to the cottage at a distance, never getting closer than 3 paces, and when he held the door open, she hesitated on the threshold like it might be a trap. "I have only one room," Quinton said, gesturing to the interior of his small home. It was simple but well kept. A hearth with a fire burning low, a table and 2 chairs, shelves with supplies and a few books, and in the corner, his bed with its patchwork quilt. "But there's a guest room upstairs. It's small but dry with a proper bed and blankets." The orc girl stepped inside, leaving muddy footprints on the stone floor, and looked around with those wary amber eyes. Quinton shut the door against the storm and set about lighting another lamp. When he turned back, she was standing exactly where he'd left her, dripping onto his floor, her hands loose at her sides but her posture radiating tension. "Sit," he said, pulling out one of the chairs. "Let me see the leg." She didn't sit. Instead, she moved to the corner farthest from the bed, away from the fire's warmth, and slowly lowered herself to the cold stone floor. She pulled her injured leg in close and wrapped her arms around her knees, making herself as small as possible. Quinton frowned. "The chair's more comfortable." "This is enough," she said quietly, not meeting his eyes. Something about the way she said it, the flatness in her voice, made Quinton's chest tighten. He'd seen that kind of resignation before, in the eyes of men who'd been broken by war, who no longer believed they deserved even basic kindness. He'd worn that look himself once before he'd left the king's army and come to this remote corner of the frontier to farm and forget. "What's your name?" he asked instead of arguing. She was silent for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. Then, "Grishka. I'm Quinton." He grabbed his medical supplies from the shelf, a wooden box filled with bandages, salves, and the knowledge he'd accumulated patching up wounded soldiers. "I'm going to need to clean that wound, Grishka. It'll hurt, but infection will hurt worse." She gave that sharp nod again and unwrapped her arms from her knees, extending the injured leg slightly. Quinton knelt on the floor beside her, close enough that he could smell the rain and mud and something else, something wild like pine and earth. The cut was deep, running from her knee to her ankle and filled with dirt and debris. "How did this happen?" he asked, uncorking his water skin. "Hunters," Grishka said. "3 days ago I escaped, but one had a spear." Quinton's hands stilled. "They were hunting you specifically." "They were hunting orcs." She said it without inflection, a simple statement of fact. "There is a bounty in the southern settlements, 10 silver for proof of kill. 10 silver, the price of a good milk cow." Quinton's jaw clenched as he poured water over the wound, washing away the worst of the filth. Grishka's breath hissed between her teeth, but she didn't pull away, didn't make a sound beyond that initial reaction. "This is going to need stitching," he said, examining the deepest part of the gash. "Do you want something to bite down on? I have endured worse." He believed her. Quinton threaded the curved needle he used for mending harnesses and leather, the closest thing he had to medical equipment, and began the slow process of closing the wound. Grishka sat motionless as stone, her hands braced on the floor beside her, her breathing controlled and deliberate. Only the slight tremor in her shoulders betrayed the pain she must be feeling. "Why did you come this far north?" Quinton asked, partly to distract her and partly because he was genuinely curious. His farm sat at the very edge of the settled lands, where the kingdom's influence gave way to wilderness and the territories the orcs claimed as their own. "I was cast out," Grishka said after a moment. "I refuse to raid a human village. My clan does not tolerate weakness." Quinton glanced up at her face, surprised. "That's not weakness. To them it is." Her amber eyes met his, and for the first time he saw something other than wariness there, a deep and abiding sadness. "They said I had forgotten what it means to be orc, that I had been corrupted by human sentiment. Because you didn't want to kill people. Because I questioned whether we must always be at war." She looked away toward the fire. "I watched my brother die in a raid when I was 12. He was 15, barely old enough to carry a blade. The humans killed him defending their grain stores, and when we brought his body back, the elders said he died with honor. I looked at his face and saw only waste." Quinton tied off the last stitch and reached for the salve, a mixture of honey and herbs that an old healer had taught him to make. He spread it carefully over the wound, then began wrapping it with clean linen. "I was a soldier," he said quietly, "fought in the border campaigns for 6 years. I've killed orcs in battle, and I watched friends die to orc blades, but I never thought there was honor in it, just necessity and waste, like you said." Grishka's gaze returned to him, searching his face for something. "Then why do you live here on the border between our peoples?" "Because I'm tired of fighting." Quinton tied off the bandage and sat back on his heels. Out here, I don't have to be a soldier anymore. I can just be a farmer, or at least that was the idea. But you helped me." She gestured to her bandaged leg. "I am your enemy." "You're a girl bleeding on my doorstep," Quinton said. "Enemy doesn't enter into it." The storm raged on outside, and Quinton built up the fire while Grishka remained in her corner, watching him with those unreadable eyes. He put a pot of stew on to heat, left over from his dinner, and when it was warm he ladled some into a bowl and brought it to her. "Eat," he said, offering it with a spoon. Grishka took the bowl but didn't raise it to her lips. She stared down at the stew like it might be poisoned, her tusks catching the firelight as she worried her lower lip between her teeth. "It's just rabbit and vegetables," Quinton said. "Nothing fancy, but it'll keep you warm. Why are you being kind to me?" The question burst out of her like she couldn't contain it any longer. "I am Orc. I destroyed your fence. I am worth 10 silver dead. Why do you feed me and tend my wounds and offer me your guest bed?" Quinton settled into the chair and picked up his own bowl. "Because you're a person and you're hurt, and I have the means to help. It's not more complicated than that. Everything is more complicated than that." Grishka finally took a tentative sip of the stew, and something flickered across her face, too quick for him to identify. Pleasure, maybe, or simple relief. She took another sip, then another, and soon she was eating with the desperate efficiency of someone who hadn't had a proper meal in days. Quinton let her eat in silence, waiting until she'd scraped the bowl clean before he spoke again. "The guest room is upstairs. It's not much, but there's a bed with a straw mattress and wool blankets. You'll be warm and dry." Grishka set the bowl down carefully. "I will sleep here on the floor." "Grishka, this is enough," she said again, and this time her voice was firmer, almost defiant. "I will not take more than I need. The floor is dry. It is warm from the fire. This is more than I have had in many days." Quinton wanted to argue, wanted to insist that she take the comfort he offered, but something in her expression stopped him. This wasn't about the bed, he realized. This was about control, about maintaining some sense of dignity in a situation where she had none. If he pushed, he'd only make it worse. "All right," he said quietly, "but I'm leaving the blankets by the stairs. If you change your mind, they're there." He did exactly that, fetching 2 thick wool blankets and placing them on the bottom step where she could reach them easily. Then he banked the fire for the night, checked that the door was barred against the storm, and retreated to his own bed. He didn't undress beyond removing his boots, and he kept his knife within easy reach, not because he feared Grishka would attack him in the night, but because old habits from his soldier days died hard. Sleep didn't come easily. He lay in the darkness, listening to the rain and the occasional pop of settling embers, aware of the orc girl on his floor just a dozen paces away. He wondered what she was thinking, whether she slept or lay awake as he did, whether she would still be there in the morning or if she'd slip away before dawn. Eventually, exhaustion claimed him, and when he woke to pale gray light filtering through the shutters, the storm had passed. Quinton sat up slowly, expecting to find the corner empty and the blankets untouched. Instead, Grishka was still there, curled on her side on the cold stone floor, her arms wrapped around herself for warmth. The blankets lay exactly where he'd left them, and in the morning light he could see that her lips had a faint blue tinge, her green skin paler than it should be. She'd spent the entire night in the cold rather than accept the comfort he'd offered. Something fierce and protective surged through Quinton's chest. He got up as quietly as he could and built up the fire, adding wood until it roared to life and heat began to fill the room. Then he went to the kitchen area and started breakfast, making more noise than necessary in the hopes it would wake her gently rather than startling her. It worked. Grishka stirred, her eyes opening slowly. And for just a moment before she remembered where she was, Quinton saw vulnerability in her face, a softness that disappeared the instant she registered his presence. She pushed herself upright with a wince, her injured leg clearly stiff and sore. "Morning," Quinton said, keeping his tone casual. "How's the leg? It will heal." Grishka tested it carefully, flexing her foot, and though her jaw tightened, she didn't cry out. "Thank you for your aid. I will leave now." "After breakfast," Quinton said firmly, "and after I check that bandage." "Then if you want to leave, I won't stop you." He could see her weighing the offer, calculating risks and obligations. Finally, she nodded. Quinton served eggs and bread with butter, strong tea sweetened with honey, and they ate in silence broken only by the crackle of the fire. When the meal was finished, he checked her bandage and was relieved to find no signs of infection, the wound already beginning to knit together with the resilience of orc physiology. "You heal fast," he observed. "My people do." Grishka stood, testing her weight on the leg. "It will be fully closed in a week, less if I rest." "Then rest here." The words were out before Quinton could think better of them. "Stay a few days, let yourself heal properly. I could use the help anyway, fixing that fence you destroyed." Grishka stared at him. "You want me to stay?" "I'm offering," Quinton said. "There's work to be done, and you look like you could use a safe place to recover. When you're healed and the fence is fixed, you can go wherever you need to go." "Why?" she asked again, and he was beginning to understand it was her favorite question. "Because I remember what it's like to have nowhere to go," Quinton said honestly. "And because I meant what I said last night. Enemy doesn't enter into it." She was quiet for a long moment, her gaze drifting to the window and the forest beyond. "I do not know where I would go," she admitted finally, so softly he almost didn't hear. "I have no clan, no family. The wilderness is vast, but it is also lonely." "Then stay," Quinton said. "For a few days at least." Grishka looked at him, really looked at him, and Quinton found himself holding his breath. Then slowly she nodded. "For a few days, to repay my debt for the fence and your kindness." Relief flooded through him, though he wasn't entirely sure why. "Good, but there's one condition." Her eyes narrowed warily. "What condition?" "You sleep in the guest room, or at minimum, you use the blankets. I'm not having you freeze on my floor when there are better options." "I told you the floor is enough." "It's not about enough," Quinton interrupted gently. "It's about what's available. I have a guest room that's sitting empty. You using it doesn't take anything from me, Grishka. It's just common sense." She opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again. He could see the conflict in her face, the war between her pride and her practical nature. "I am not accustomed to comfort," she said finally. "Among orcs, we are taught that softness makes us weak, that we must always be ready for hardship." "You can be ready for hardship and still take rest when it's offered," Quinton said. "A soldier who doesn't sleep in a real bed when one's available is a fool, not a hero. He'll just be too tired to fight when it matters." Something flickered in her eyes, maybe recognition, maybe respect. "You speak from experience. 6 years of it." Quinton moved to the stairs. "Come on. Let me at least show you the room." Grishka followed him up the narrow wooden stairs, favoring her injured leg slightly. The upper floor was really just a loft, divided by a curtain into 2 spaces. Quinton's side held a small desk and his few personal belongings. The guest side had a simple rope bed with a straw mattress, a chest for storage, and a window that looked out over the fields and forest. "It's not much," Quinton said, "but it's yours while you're here." Grishka stepped into the small space, her eyes taking in every detail. She moved to the window and looked out, and Quinton saw her shoulders relax slightly, just a fraction. "I can see for miles," she said. "I would know if anyone approached." Of course. She was still thinking like prey, like someone being hunted. The realization made Quinton's chest ache. "No one knows you're here," he said quietly. "And even if they did, they'd have to go through me to get to you." She turned to look at him over her shoulder, her expression unreadable. "You do not know me, Quinton Quade. I could be dangerous. I could be planning to rob you or worse. Are you?" "No." "Then we don't have a problem." He gestured to the bed. "Try it at least. If you hate it, you can go back to the floor." Grishka approached the bed like it might bite her, running her fingers over the rough blanket that covered it. Then, moving with obvious reluctance, she sat on the edge. The rope supports creaked under her weight and she tensed, but when nothing collapsed, she leaned back slightly, testing. "It is soft," she said, as if this were somehow suspicious. "That's generally the idea with beds." Quinton couldn't quite keep the amusement from his voice. Grishka shot him a look, but there was no real heat in it. She lay back fully, staring up at the ceiling, and for just a moment, her guard dropped completely and he saw pure wonder in her face. "I have never slept on anything like this," she admitted. "We use furs and pelts on the ground or on stone shelves. This is different. Good different or bad different?" She considered the question seriously. "I do not know yet. It feels like something I should not have." "Well, you do have it for as long as you're here." Quinton moved back toward the stairs, giving her space. "I'm going to start on the fence. If your leg is hurting, stay up here and rest. If you feel up to it, come down and I'll find you something to do that doesn't require heavy lifting." He left her there and spent the morning working on the ruined fence, pulling out the broken boards and setting new posts. The work was familiar and meditative, and it gave him time to think about the situation he'd gotten himself into. Harboring an orc, even temporarily, could bring him serious trouble if the wrong people found out. His neighbors were already suspicious of anyone who lived this far from the village, and they'd be outright hostile if they knew he was sheltering one of the enemy. But Quinton had stopped caring about other people's opinions when he left the army. Out here, he made his own choices and lived with the consequences. And if that meant helping a girl who'd been cast out by her own people and hunted by his, then so be it. Around midday, Grishka emerged from the cottage. She'd cleaned the worst of the mud from her clothes and bound her hair back from her face, revealing the sharp angles of her cheekbones and the delicate points of her ears. She moved carefully, still favoring the injured leg but with more confidence than the night before. "What can I do?" she asked. Quinton straightened from his work, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Can you hold posts steady while I set them?" "Yes." They worked together in companionable silence, Grishka bracing the posts while Quinton tamped earth and stone around them to hold them firm. She was stronger than she looked, her hands steady and sure, and she seemed to understand the work without needing detailed instructions. By the time the sun began its descent toward the horizon, they'd made good progress, replacing nearly half the damaged section. "Enough for today," Quinton said, gathering his tools. "Let's get some food." Dinner was simple, bread and cheese and dried apples, with cold well water to drink. They ate at the table this time, Grishka in one chair and Quinton in the other, and though she was still quiet, some of the tension had left her posture. When the meal was done, she helped him clean up without being asked, learning the rhythm of his household through observation. As darkness fell, Quinton lit the lamps and Grishka retreated upstairs without a word. He stayed by the fire, mending a torn shirt and trying not to think about the orc girl sleeping in his guest room, trying not to wonder why her presence felt less like an intrusion and more like something that had been missing. The days fell into a pattern. They woke with the sun, ate breakfast together, and worked on various tasks around the farm. Grishka's leg healed quickly, and soon she was moving without any sign of a limp. She was a quick learner and a tireless worker, attacking every job with an intensity that spoke of deep-seated need to prove her worth. She helped him repair the fence, mend the barn roof, weed the vegetable garden, and split firewood for the coming winter. In the evenings, they ate dinner and sat by the fire, and slowly, carefully, they began to talk. Grishka told him about life in the orc clans, the rigid hierarchy and constant struggle for status, the way strength was valued above all else and weakness punished without mercy. She spoke of her mother, who had died when Grishka was young, and her father, who had been ashamed of her for her softer nature. "He wanted me to be fierce," she said one night, staring into the flames, "like my brother was before he died, but I could not make myself care about honor and glory. I only saw the cost." "That doesn't make you weak," Quinton said. "That makes you wise." Grishka shook her head. "In my clan, wisdom and weakness are the same thing if they prevent you from fighting." Quinton told her about his own past in return, about growing up in a small village and joining the army at 16 because he'd wanted adventure and purpose. He described the border campaigns, the endless skirmishes and raids that accomplished nothing except filling graves on both sides. He told her about his best friend, a man named Thomas who'd saved his life twice and died in a meaningless fight over a river crossing that neither side actually needed. "After that, I couldn't do it anymore," he said. "I finished my contract and came out here as far from the fighting as I could get. I thought if I just worked the land and kept to myself, I could forget." "Has it worked?" Grishka asked. "Some days." Quinton met her eyes across the firelight. "Some days I still see Thomas's face or hear the sound of men screaming, but it's better than it was." "I understand," she said quietly. "I dream of my brother sometimes. He calls for me to help him, but I cannot reach him in time." They sat in silence after that, bound by shared grief and shared understanding. Quinton found himself looking forward to these evening conversations, to the way Grishka's guard would lower as the night deepened, revealing glimpses of the person beneath the armor she wore. She had a sharp wit when she let it show, a dry sense of humor that caught him off guard and made him laugh in ways he hadn't in years. A week passed, then two. The fence was long since repaired, and Grishka's leg had healed completely, the wound reduced to a pale scar barely visible against her green skin. By all rights, she should have moved on, but neither of them mentioned it. She continued to work alongside him, earning her keep and then some, and if Quinton's farm had never run more smoothly, he told himself it was just the benefit of an extra pair of hands. He tried not to notice the way his heart lifted when he saw her in the mornings, or the way he found excuses to work near her during the day. He tried not to think about the curve of her jaw, or the strength in her hands, or the rare, brilliant smile that transformed her entire face when something genuinely pleased her. It was getting harder, though, especially when he'd catch her watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read, or when their fingers would brush as they passed tools and she'd pull back like she'd been burned. The careful balance they'd established shattered on a cool autumn morning when Quinton went into the village for supplies. He made the trip once a month, buying what he couldn't grow or make himself, and he'd timed this one for when he needed to stock up before winter. Grishka had offered to come, but he'd refused, knowing how the villagers would react to an orc in their midst. "I'll be back before dark," he promised. "Stay close to the house, and if anyone comes, hide in the loft." Grishka had nodded, but he could see the worry in her eyes, the fear that he might not come back at all. That realization stayed with him during the long walk to the village, warming him against the autumn chill. The village of Redbrook was small and insular, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business. Quinton kept to himself as much as possible, exchanging coins for goods with minimal conversation, but this time he couldn't avoid notice. He was loading his purchases into his pack when he heard a familiar voice behind him. Quinton Quade. Been a while since we've seen you down from that hermit farm of yours. Quinton turned to find Marcus Reed, a man he'd served with briefly in the army, now working as the village deputy constable. They'd never been friends, but they'd shared a tent during a particularly miserable winter campaign, which created a kind of grudging acquaintance. "Marcus," Quinton said neutrally, "keeping well enough." Marcus leaned against the wall of the general store, his hand resting casually on the cudgel at his belt. "Heard an interesting rumor the other day. Thought you might want to know about it." Quinton's stomach tightened, but he kept his expression neutral. "Oh, hunters came through about 3 weeks back. Said they'd been tracking an orc girl wounded heading north toward the frontier. Lost her trail in a storm." Marcus's eyes were sharp, assessing. "Your farm is about the furthest north anyone settled. You wouldn't happen to have seen anything, would you?" "I see deer and rabbits," Quinton said evenly. "The occasional wolf, that's about it." "Right." Marcus pushed off the wall. "Thing is, there's bounty on that particular orc. Not just the standard 10 silver. Turns out she's some kind of deserter from one of the northern clans. They've put 20 silver on her head, and that's just from the human side. Word is her own people would pay even more to get her back. 20 silver. Quinton's hands clenched into fists before he could stop himself. That was more money than most farmers saw in a year. Enough to buy livestock, improve land, survive a bad harvest. "Good luck to whoever finds her then," he said. Marcus studied him for a long moment. "You always were a bleeding heart, Quad. Remember when you tried to get the captain to spare those orc prisoners, said they were just boys? Nearly got court-martialed for it." "They were just boys," Quinton said flatly. "Youngest couldn't have been more than 14. They were orcs." Marcus shook his head. "Look, I don't care what you do up there on your farm. You want to live like a hermit, that's your business. But if you're doing something stupid, something that's going to bring trouble down on this village, I need to know about it." "I'm not bringing trouble to anyone," Quinton said. "I keep to myself and tend my land, that's all." Marcus held his gaze for another moment, then shrugged. "All right, but when those hunters come back this way, and they will, I'm going to send them up toward your place, just to be thorough. You understand?" "I understand you've got a job to do." Quinton shouldered his pack. "And I've got a long walk home." He left the village at a fast pace that wasn't quite running, his mind racing. 20 silver, hunters on their way back. Marcus's suspicions. Even if the deputy didn't truly believe Grishka was at the farm, he'd send the hunters to check, if only to cover himself. Quinton made the walk back in record time, arriving as the sun was setting. He found Grishka in the garden, pulling the last of the root vegetables before the first frost. She looked up at his approach, and whatever she saw in his face made her stand quickly, a turnip still clutched in her hand. "What happened?" "Inside," Quinton said tersely. "We need to talk." He told her everything while they stood in the kitchen, the words tumbling out in a rush. Grishka listened without interrupting, her face growing more closed with every sentence. When he finished, she set down the turnip she'd been holding with careful precision. "I will leave tonight," she said. "What? No." Quinton stepped toward her, then stopped himself. "That's not what I'm saying. It is the only logical solution." Grishka's voice was calm, almost detached. "If I am gone when the hunters come, they will find nothing. You can tell them the truth. You saw no orc. Your property will be safe, and you will not be implicated in harboring an enemy." "I don't care about being implicated," Quinton said, "and I don't want you to leave." The words hung in the air between them, heavier than he'd intended. Grishka's eyes widened slightly, and he saw her throat work as she swallowed. "Quinton, listen to me." He closed the distance between them, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her amber eyes. "In the last 2 weeks, you've become I look forward to seeing you every morning. I like working beside you and talking with you and just knowing you're here. The thought of you leaving, of you going back out into the wilderness alone with hunters tracking you, it makes me feel like someone's kicked me in the chest." "You cannot mean that," Grishka whispered. "I am orc. You are human. This is impossible. It's only impossible if we decide it is." Quinton reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hand. Her skin was warm, her palm calloused from work. "I know it's complicated. I know there are 100 reasons why this is a terrible idea, but I also know that I haven't felt this alive, this hopeful, since before the war. And I think, maybe, you feel something too." Grishka stared at their joined hands like she didn't quite believe they were real. "I do not know what I feel," she said finally. "I have never felt anything like this. Among orcs, matings are practical arrangements, alliances between families. This thing in my chest when I look at you, this warmth and fear and longing all mixed together, I have no name for it." "I think the name might be love," Quinton said gently. "Or at least the beginning of it." She looked up at him, and he saw tears gathering in her eyes, making them shine in the lamplight. "If I stay, I bring danger to you. The hunters will not stop. My clan will not stop. We will always be looking over our shoulders. Then we'll look over our shoulders together." Quinton lifted his other hand to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear that had escaped. "I'm not asking you to marry me tomorrow, Grishka. I'm just asking you not to leave. Stay, and we'll figure out the rest as we go." For a moment he thought she'd refuse, thought her practical nature would override everything else and she'd walk out into the night. Then she leaned into his touch, just slightly, and nodded. "I will stay," she whispered, "for as long as you will have me." Quinton drew her into his arms, and she came willingly, her head tucking under his chin as if she'd been made to fit there. She was taller than human women, nearly matching his height, and strong in a way that made him feel safe rather than threatened. He felt her shaking slightly, and realized she was crying, silent tears that soaked into his shirt. "It's all right," he murmured into her hair. "We'll make it work." They stood like that for a long time, holding each other in the lamplight while the fire crackled and the night deepened outside. When they finally pulled apart, Grishka's eyes were red but determined. "If I stay, we must be prepared," she said. "The hunters will come, and when they do, we need a plan." Quinton nodded, grateful for her practicality even as his heart was still racing from their embrace. "What do you suggest?" They spent the evening preparing. Grishka knew the tactics hunters used, the way they'd surround a property and search every building. She suggested hiding places, ways to obscure her presence, techniques for throwing off tracking dogs if it came to that. Quinton contributed his own knowledge from his military days, thinking through sight lines and defensive positions. "The loft is the obvious place," Grishka said, looking up at the ceiling. "But also the first place they will look. I could hide in the forest, watch from a distance, but if they have dogs, they might pick up my scent trail." "What about the root cellar?" Quinton gestured to the trapdoor hidden beneath a rug near the kitchen. "It's small and it's dark, but it's cool enough that scent doesn't linger well. If we move some of the stores around, there's a space behind the barrels where you could fit." Grishka went down to investigate and came back nodding. "It would work for a short time. But Quinton, you realize that if they find me, they will assume you were hiding me. You could be arrested, fined, maybe worse. I know the risks." He met her eyes steadily. "I'm willing to take them." She studied his face for a long moment, then crossed to him and rose up on her toes to press a kiss to his cheek. It was chaste, almost innocent, but it sent heat racing through his veins. "Thank you," she said softly. "No one has ever risked anything for me before." "Then they were all fools," Quinton said, and was rewarded with one of her rare, brilliant smiles. "The hunters came 3 days later." Quinton was mending a hole in the barn roof when he spotted them approaching, 4 men on horseback with dogs on leads. He scrambled down the ladder and ran to the cottage, where Grishka was preparing vegetables for the evening meal. "They're here," he said tersely. Grishka didn't panic. She simply set down her knife, moved to the root cellar, and descended into the darkness. Quinton helped her arrange the barrels to hide the space, then lowered the trapdoor and kicked the rug back over it. He took a moment to scan the room for any signs of her presence, grabbed the vegetables she'd been working on and dumped them into the pot on the fire, then went outside to meet the hunters. They were rough-looking men, the kind who made their living in the gray areas between law and banditry. Their leader was a scarred veteran with cold eyes, and he looked Quinton up and down with obvious dismissal. "This Quade's farm?" he asked without preamble. "It is. I'm Quade." Quinton kept his voice level, his posture relaxed. "What can I do for you? We're tracking an orc girl. Wounded, dangerous. She was headed this direction about a month back." The hunter gestured to his companions. "We're authorized to search properties in pursuit of bounty targets. You going to make this difficult?" "I haven't seen any orcs," Quinton said, "but you're welcome to look around. Just don't disturb my livestock." The hunter's eyes narrowed, clearly suspicious of Quinton's cooperation, but he nodded. "Smart man. Boys, search the buildings. Check everywhere." Quinton stood in the yard and watched as they tore through his property. They searched the barn first, poking into every stall and climbing into the loft to check the hay. They searched the small chicken coop, the tool shed, even the outhouse. Finally, they turned to the cottage itself. Quinton led them inside, his heart pounding so hard he was sure they could hear it. The dogs sniffed around the room, whining and pulling at their leads, but the hunters attributed it to the cooking food rather than anything suspicious. They checked the loft thoroughly, pulling back the curtain and searching through Quinton's belongings with no regard for privacy. "What's under here?" one of the hunters asked, nudging the rug with his boot. "Root cellar," Quinton said. "I can show you if you want, but it's just vegetables and preserves." The hunter lifted the trapdoor and peered down into the darkness. Quinton held his breath, praying that Grishka was well hidden, that the gloom was deep enough to conceal her. The hunter wrinkled his nose at the smell of earth and onions, then let the door fall closed. "Nothing," he reported to his leader. They searched for another 20 minutes, checking under the bed, inside the few chests Quinton owned, even examining the chimney for hidden compartments. Finally, the leader called his men off. "Seems clean," he admitted grudgingly. "You really haven't seen anything." "I see deer and rabbits," Quinton said, echoing what he'd told Marcus. "The occasional wolf, that's it." "You're pretty far out here on your own," the hunter observed. "Not worried about orc raids. I keep to myself. They leave me alone." Quinton shrugged. "I'm not worth raiding. No gold, no livestock they'd want, just a small farm." The hunter grunted. "Well, if you do see anything, there's 20 silver in it. That's good money for a farmer." "I'll keep it in mind," Quinton said, knowing he'd cut off his own hand before he'd betray Grishka. The hunters mounted up and rode off, their dogs trailing behind. Quinton watched until they disappeared into the tree line, then counted to 100 before returning to the cottage. He moved the rug, lifted the trapdoor, and climbed down into the cellar. "They're gone," he said to the darkness. There was a moment of silence, then Grishka emerged from behind the barrels, her eyes huge in the dim light. She was shaking, and when Quinton reached for her she collapsed against him, her breath coming in short gasps. "I thought they would find me," she said against his chest. "I heard them walking above, heard the dogs. I was certain." "You were quiet as a ghost," Quinton assured her, running his hands up and down her back in soothing strokes. "Come on, let's get you out of here." They climbed back into the cottage, and Quinton shut the cellar securely. Grishka moved to the window, watching the forest with wary eyes. "They will come back," she said. "Maybe not today or tomorrow, but they will come back. Then we'll deal with it when they do." Quinton came to stand beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. "We survived this time. We'll survive the next." Grishka turned to look at him, and there was something fierce and vulnerable in her expression. "I am afraid," she admitted. "Not of the hunters, but of this, of what I feel for you. I have been alone for so long, and now I have something to lose." "I'm afraid too," Quinton said, "but I think it's worth being afraid for." She reached out and took his hand, lacing their fingers together. "Among my people, when a mating bond forms, we mark it with scars. We cut our palms and press them together, mingling blood. It is a promise that cannot be undone." "Is that what you want?" Quinton asked. "A promise that cannot be undone." Grishka was quiet for a long moment, her thumb tracing patterns on the back of his hand. "I want to know that I am not alone anymore," she said finally. "I want to know that someone sees me as more than a burden, more than a debt to be repaid. I want to belong somewhere to someone." "You belong here," Quinton said, lifting their joined hands to his lips and pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "With me, for as long as you want to stay." "Forever," Grishka whispered. "I want to stay forever." Quinton pulled her into his arms and kissed her properly this time, not chaste or careful but deep and claiming. She made a small sound of surprise that turned into a sigh, her arms coming up to wrap around his neck as she kissed him back with a fierceness that made his head spin. She tasted like the herbs she'd been chopping, and something wild and sweet that was uniquely her. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Quinton rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," he said, the words as simple and true as anything he'd ever spoken. "I know it's fast and I know it's complicated, but I love you." "I love you too," Grishka said, and hearing her say it in her rough, accented voice made something in Quinton's chest swell almost painfully. "I do not know how this happened, but I know that I am yours if you will have me." "I'll have you," Quinton promised, "in whatever way you'll let me." They stood there in the fading light, holding each other and stealing kisses, until Grishka finally pulled back with a shaky laugh. "The food is burning," she said, gesturing to the pot on the fire. Quinton swore and rushed to rescue their dinner, managing to save most of it from being reduced to charcoal. They ate at the table, playing footsie like children and grinning at each other over their bowls, and Quinton thought he'd never been happier in his entire life. That night, Grishka came to him. He was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling and thinking about her in the loft above, when he heard the soft pad of bare feet on the stairs. She appeared beside his bed like a ghost, wearing only her sleep shirt, her hair loose around her shoulders. "Can I stay with you?" she asked quietly. "I do not want to be alone tonight." Quinton shifted over, making room, and she slid under the covers beside him. He pulled her close, feeling the length of her body against his, warm and solid and real. She tucked her head under his chin with a sigh, her hand splayed over his heart. "Is this all right?" she asked. "This is perfect," Quinton said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. They lay like that, wrapped around each other until sleep claimed them both. And if Quinton's dreams were sweeter than they'd been in years, filled with images of green skin and amber eyes, and a future that felt possible rather than impossible, he wasn't complaining. The weeks that followed were the happiest of Quinton's life. He and Grishka fell into a new rhythm, one that included stolen kisses while working, evening cuddles by the fire, and nights spent tangled together in his bed. They were careful, aware that they were still in danger, but within the boundaries of the farm they allowed themselves to simply be happy. Grishka began to relax in ways Quinton had never seen. She smiled more easily, laughed at his terrible jokes, and sometimes sang while she worked, old orc songs in a language he didn't understand but found beautiful anyway. She told him stories about her childhood, the rare good memories mixed with the difficult ones, and he shared his own past in return. They talked about the future, carefully at first and then with growing confidence. Quinton wanted to expand the farm, maybe get a few sheep or goats. Grishka suggested they could trade with some of the more isolated trappers who wouldn't ask questions about her presence, bring in a little extra income. They made plans like they had all the time in the world, but the world, of course, had other plans. It was a cold morning in late autumn when Grishka went out to gather firewood and didn't come back. Quinton waited an hour, then two, before going out to look for her. He found the basket she'd been carrying, overturned in the dirt and signs of a struggle. His blood ran cold as he read the tracks. At least 5 orcs moving fast, dragging someone. Her clan had found her. Quinton didn't think. He grabbed his old military sword from where it hung above the mantel, strapped on his leather armor that he'd kept from his soldier days, and followed the trail. He tracked enemies through worse terrain during the war, and fear sharpened his senses to a razor edge. The trail led north and east, deeper into the wilderness, and he followed it at a run, his heart pounding with terror and rage in equal measure. He caught up to them by midday. The orcs had stopped in a clearing to rest, and Quinton crouched in the undergrowth, assessing the situation. There were 5 of them, all male, all armed. Grishka was bound hand and foot, a gag in her mouth, and there was a fresh bruise blooming on her cheek. One of the orcs, a massive warrior with ritual scars covering his arms, was berating her in the orcish tongue. Quinton understood enough to get the gist. They were calling her traitor, coward, disgrace to her bloodline. They were taking her back to face judgment from the clan elders, which meant execution or worse. He should have been smart about it. He should have gone back for help, or found some clever way to even the odds. But seeing Grishka hurt and terrified burned away his capacity for strategy, leaving only the soldier he'd once been. Quinton stepped out of the undergrowth with his sword drawn. "Let her go," he said in his command voice, the one that had once ordered men into battle. The orc spun to face him, hands going to weapons. The leader, the one with the scars, looked him up and down and laughed. "A human. You dare interfere in clan business?" "I dare," Quinton said. "She's under my protection. She is a deserter and a disgrace." The leader spat on the ground. "She will return to face justice. The only thing she's going to face is me if you don't let her go." Quinton raised his sword, falling into a fighter's stance that was as familiar as breathing. "I'll give you one chance to walk away." The orcs exchanged glances, clearly torn between amusement and anger. Then the leader drew his own blade, a massive cleaver-like weapon. "Kill him," he ordered his companions. "Quickly." 4 orcs rushed Quinton while the leader hung back, watching. Quinton met the first with a slash that opened the orc's arm to the bone, then pivoted to parry a strike from the second. His training came back like he'd never left the army, muscle memory guiding his blade. He was outnumbered and outmatched in terms of raw strength, but he had speed and skill and desperation on his side. He ducked under a wild swing, drove his blade into an orc's thigh, pulled it free and spun to block another attack. Blood sprayed his and theirs, and the clearing filled with the sound of clashing steel and grunts of effort. Quinton took a cut to his shoulder that made his left arm go numb, but he kept fighting, kept moving, because stopping meant death and death meant losing Grishka. One orc went down clutching his stomach. Another fell with a scream, his leg nearly severed. The remaining 2 backed off, circling warily, and Quinton used the moment to glance at Grishka. She was struggling against her bonds, her eyes wide and terrified, not for herself but for him. The leader stepped forward, his patience apparently exhausted. "Enough," he growled. "I will kill you myself, human, and make the traitor watch." He attacked with brutal efficiency, his massive blade whistling through the air in strikes that would have cleaved Quinton in half if they'd connected. Quinton gave ground, parrying when he could and dodging when he couldn't, his wounded arm screaming in protest. The orc was stronger, but Quinton was faster, and he used that advantage ruthlessly, darting in to score shallow cuts and dancing back before the counterattack could land. But he was tiring and the orc wasn't. It was only a matter of time before he made a mistake. It came when his foot caught on a root and he stumbled. The orc's blade came down in a killing stroke, and Quinton knew he couldn't block it, couldn't dodge it, that this was how he died. Then Grishka was there. She'd somehow gotten her bonds loose, and she threw herself between Quinton and the blade with a scream of defiance. The sword hit her in the side with a sickening thud, and she went down hard. The orc leader stared in shock at what he'd done, and that moment of hesitation was all Quinton needed. He drove his sword up under the orc's ribs with all his remaining strength, angling for the heart. The orc's eyes went wide, then glassy, and he toppled backward, dead before he hit the ground. The two remaining orcs took one look at their fallen leader and ran, crashing through the undergrowth in their haste to escape. Quinton let them go. His entire focus was on Grishka, who lay in a spreading pool of blood, her breathing shallow and labored. "No," he said, dropping to his knees beside her. "No, no, no, Grishka, stay with me." Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused with pain. "Quinton," she whispered, "you came." "Of course I came, you stubborn woman." He pulled off his shirt and pressed it to the wound in her side, trying to stanch the bleeding. "I told you I wouldn't let anyone take you." "I am sorry," she said, her hand coming up to touch his face. "I should have been more careful. I should have seen them coming. Don't you dare apologize." Quinton's vision blurred with tears. "Just stay awake, all right? I'm going to get you home and you're going to be fine." He knew it was a lie even as he said it. The wound was too deep, the blood loss too great. Even with orc healing, she was fading fast. But he couldn't accept it, couldn't let her go. He pulled her into his arms, holding her close, and felt her blood soaking into his skin. "Quinton," Grishka said softly, "I need to tell you something. Save your strength, listen." She coughed, and blood flecked her lips. "I have never been happy until I met you. You gave me a home and a purpose and love, things I never thought I would have. Thank you for that. Thank you for seeing me as more than what I was born to be." "You're not allowed to say goodbye," Quinton said fiercely. "You're going to survive this, and we're going to grow old together on that farm. We'll get those sheep you wanted, and you'll teach me to speak Orcish properly, and we'll have a life. Do you hear me? A life." Grishka smiled, and even dying she was beautiful. "I would have liked that," she whispered, her eyes closed, and her hand fell away from his face. Quinton felt something inside him break, felt a howl of grief building in his chest that threatened to tear him apart. But then he felt it, a faint flutter of pulse beneath his fingers. She wasn't dead, not yet. She was close, so close he could practically see death hovering over her shoulder, but she was still alive. Quinton made a decision. He stood, cradling Grishka in his arms, and started walking. Not back toward his farm, but deeper into the wilderness, toward the one place that might be able to help. He'd heard stories in the army, tales of an old hermit who lived in the deep forest, a healer with knowledge of both human and orc medicine. Some said he was a deserter like Quinton. Others claimed he was a half-breed who belonged to neither race. Most thought he was just a myth. Quinton prayed he was real. He walked for hours, following half-remembered directions from campfire stories, his arms burning with the effort of carrying Grishka's dead weight. She barely breathed, her skin cold and clammy, but she held on with the same stubbornness that had made her refuse his guest bed that first night. The sun was setting when he finally found it. A small cottage built into the side of a hill, smoke rising from its chimney. Quinton staggered to the door and kicked it with his boot, too exhausted to knock properly. The door opened to reveal a wizened old man with the pointed ears of an orc but the lighter skin of a human. A half-breed, just like the stories said. He took one look at Grishka and stepped aside. "Bring her in," he said in a voice like gravel. "Quickly now." Quinton carried Grishka inside and laid her on the table the old man indicated. The hermit moved with surprising speed for someone who looked ancient, gathering supplies and barking orders. "Hold this. Press here. Don't let her move." He worked with the skill of someone who'd sewn up countless wounds, cleaning and stitching and packing the injury with herbs that smelled of mint and something sharper. Quinton watched through a haze of exhaustion, holding Grishka's hand and willing her to keep breathing. Finally, after what felt like hours, the hermit straightened. "She'll live," he said, "but it was close. Another hour and you'd have been too late." Quinton's legs gave out and he sank to the floor beside the table, his head bowed. "Thank you," he said hoarsely. "I don't know how to repay you." "You already did, by bringing her here instead of letting her die." The hermit moved to wash his hands in a basin. "I'm Garrett, by the way, and you're welcome to stay until she's strong enough to travel." "Quinton Quade," Quinton said, "and this is Grishka." "I know who you are," Garrett said. "Word travels, even out here. The human farmer who harbors an orc girl who defied hunters and fought off a clan retrieval party. You're becoming quite the legend." Quinton laughed, though it came out more like a sob. "I'm just a man trying to protect the woman I love." "That's what all the best legends are about," Garrett said. Grishka woke 3 days later. Quinton was sitting beside the bed where Garrett had moved her, holding her hand and reading aloud from one of the hermit's books, when her fingers tightened around his. "Quinton," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He nearly dropped the book in his haste to lean closer. "I'm here. You're safe." Her eyes opened, amber and beautiful and alive. "I thought I was dead." "You nearly were." Quinton pressed a kiss to her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "Don't ever do that to me again." "I will try my best." She looked around the unfamiliar room. "Where are we?" "At Garrett's cottage. He's a healer and he saved your life." Quinton helped her sit up slightly, supporting her with pillows. "How do you feel?" "Like I was stabbed," Grishka said dryly. Then her expression grew serious. "The others, the orcs who took me, what happened to them?" "2 dead, including your clan leader. The rest ran." Quinton smoothed her hair back from her face. "I don't think they'll be back. They will tell the clan what happened, that I was defended by a human, that blood was spilled." Grishka's eyes filled with tears. "Quinton, there will be war. They will see this as an act of aggression." "Let them," Quinton said firmly. "I don't care. I'll fight the whole clan if that's what it takes to keep you safe." "You cannot fight a whole clan," Grishka said, but she was smiling despite the tears. "Watch me." Garrett appeared in the doorway, carrying a tray with soup and tea. "Actually, you won't have to fight anyone if you're smart about it," he said. "There's another option." Quinton and Grishka both turned to look at him. "What option?" Quinton asked. "You go somewhere they can't follow, somewhere neither human nor orc law holds sway." Garrett set the tray down and pulled up a chair. "There's a place far to the west where the mountains meet the sea, isolated, difficult to reach, but livable if you know how to work hard. No one would bother you there." "A new start," Grishka said softly, looking at Quinton. "Together." "Is that what you want?" Quinton asked. "To leave everything behind and start over?" "I have already left everything behind," Grishka said. "My clan, my people, my old life. All I have left is you. So yes, if it means we can be together without fear, that is what I want." Quinton thought about his farm, the land he'd worked so hard to build into something productive. He thought about his few possessions, the quiet life he'd carved out of the wilderness. and he realized that none of it mattered, not compared to the woman in front of him. "Then that's what we'll do," he said. "As soon as you're healed enough to travel, we'll go west." Garrett nodded approvingly. "I can draw you a map, show you the route. It's about a month's journey on foot, longer if you run into bad weather, but it's worth it. I lived there myself for a few years before I came back east. Beautiful country and no one to tell you how to live your life." "Why did you come back?" Grishka asked. "Because I'm old and stubborn and this is where I belong." Garrett smiled and it transformed his weathered face. "But you too are young. You have time to build something new." Grishka recovered slowly over the next 2 weeks, her orc constitution fighting off infection and knitting the wound closed faster than a human could have managed. Quinton spent the time helping Garrett around the cottage and learning everything he could about the Western Territories. The hermit was a font of knowledge, teaching him which plants were edible, how to find water in unfamiliar terrain, and the best ways to avoid both human and orc settlements. "You'll want to follow the river valleys," Garrett said one evening, tracing routes on his hand-drawn map. "The highlands are faster, but there's less game and more chance of running into patrols. Stay low, stay quiet, and you'll make it through." "What about once we get there?" Quinton asked. "How do we survive?" "Same way you survive anywhere. You work hard, you adapt, and you don't give up." Garrett rolled up the map and handed it to Quinton. "You've already proven you can do all that." When Grishka was finally strong enough to walk without pain, Quinton made the trek back to his farm one last time. The cottage looked exactly as he'd left it, the dishes still in the basin, Grishka's cloak still hanging by the door. He packed what they'd need for the journey, his sturdy clothes, her few possessions, weapons, tools, and supplies. He left everything else, including a note weighted down on the table for whoever found it next. "The farm is yours if you want it. All I ask is that you take care of the land. It's good soil, and it deserves better than to go fallow." He locked the door behind him and walked away without looking back. They left Garrett's cottage on a crisp autumn morning, carrying packs filled with supplies and hope. The hermit saw them off with gruff advice and a blessing in a language Quinton didn't recognize but suspected was very old. "Take care of each other," Garrett said. "And if you ever need help, you know where to find me." "Thank you," Grishka said, embracing the old half-breed, "for everything." "Just living up to my own legend," Garrett said with a wink. "Now go on. You've got a long walk ahead of you." The journey west was hard but not unbearable. They traveled slowly because of Grishka's still healing wound, following game trails and river paths, avoiding settlements and main roads. They saw other travelers occasionally, but most people were too focused on their own business to pay attention to a human man and an orc woman walking together. At night, they made camp in hidden glens and under the shelter of ancient trees. They took turns keeping watch, though more often than not they ended up both awake, talking in quiet voices about everything and nothing. Grishka told Quinton the names of stars in the orcish tongue, and he taught her the folk songs his mother had sung when he was a child. They made love for the first time on a night when the moon was full, and the forest was alive with silver light. It was tender and awkward and perfect, Grishka gasping Quinton's name as he explored her body with reverent hands, Quinton groaning as she claimed him with a fierceness that left him breathless. Afterward, they lay tangled together in their bedrolls, sharing warmth and whispered promises. "I love you," Grishka said, tracing the scar on Quinton's shoulder from where the orc had cut him. "More than I knew it was possible to love." "I love you too," Quinton said, pressing a kiss to the scar on her side, the one that had nearly taken her from him. "And I'm going to spend the rest of my life showing you just how much." The journey took exactly 32 days. They emerged from the forest on a gray afternoon to find themselves standing on a cliff overlooking the sea. Below them, nestled in a protected valley where a river met the ocean, was the settlement Garrett had told them about. A handful of buildings, smoke rising from chimneys, and the unmistakable signs of people living in peace. "Is this it?" Grishka asked, her hand finding Quinton's. "This is it," Quinton confirmed. "Our new home." They made their way down the cliff path and into the valley. The people they met were a mixture of humans and orcs, along with a few half-breeds like Garrett, all of them refugees from the endless conflicts of the East. No one asked questions about where they'd come from or why they were together. They simply welcomed Quinton and Grishka with offers of food and shelter, and helped building a place of their own. Over the winter, Quinton and Grishka built a small cabin on the outskirts of the settlement, close enough to trade and socialize but far enough to have privacy. It was simple, just 2 rooms and a loft, but it was theirs. They filled it with handmade furniture and warm blankets and all the little touches that made a house a home. Spring came, and with it, new beginnings. Quinton planted a garden, using the skills he'd learned on his frontier farm. Grishka helped the settlement's hunters, teaching them orcish tracking techniques in exchange for meat and leather. They worked hard, laughed often, and loved each other with an intensity that showed no signs of fading. On a warm day in early summer, with wildflowers blooming in the meadow and the sea sparkling in the distance, Quinton took Grishka to a spot overlooking the valley and asked her to marry him. He didn't have a ring, but he had a knife, and together they cut their palms and pressed them together, mingling their blood in the orcish tradition. "I promise to protect you, to provide for you, and to love you for as long as I live," Quinton said, his blood running down to mix with hers. "I promise to stand beside you, to share your burdens, and to love you until the stars go dark," Grishka replied. They bound their hands together with a strip of cloth and let the wound seal, creating matching scars that they would carry for the rest of their lives. Then they kissed, long and deep, while the wind carried the scent of salt and flowers and new growth. The settlement celebrated their marriage with a feast that lasted into the night, humans and orcs dancing together in a display of harmony that would have been impossible in the East. Quinton danced with Grishka under the stars, her green skin glowing in the firelight, her smile brighter than any moon. "Are you happy?" he asked as they swayed to the music. "I am more than happy," Grishka said. "I am home." They built a life together in that valley by the sea. Quinton taught the settlement's children to read and write, passing on the education he'd received in his youth. Grishka became the settlement's primary hunter and defender, her orc strength and human compassion making her a natural leader. They worked side by side, building not just a home but a community where their love was not forbidden or strange, but simply accepted. Years passed. The cabin grew, expanding to accommodate the children they eventually had. 3 strong, beautiful half-orcs who inherited Quinton's stubbornness and Grishka's fierce heart. They raised their children to be proud of both their heritages, to see strength in diversity rather than division. On quiet evenings, when the children were asleep and the work was done, Quinton and Grishka would sit on the porch of their cabin and watch the sun set over the sea. Sometimes they talked about the past, about the night they met in the rain and the journey that had brought them here. More often, they simply sat in comfortable silence, hands clasped, content in the knowledge that they had found what so many searched for but never discovered, a place where they belonged and a love worth fighting for. "You ever regret it?" Grishka asked one night, years into their marriage. "Giving up your farm, your old life, everything you built?" Quinton looked at her, at the silver beginning to thread through her dark hair, at the laugh lines around her eyes and the scars they'd accumulated together, and he smiled. "Not for a single moment," he said. "You are my home, Grishka. Wherever you are, that's where I belong." She leaned her head on his shoulder, and they watched the stars come out one by one, the same stars that had guided them west all those years ago. In the distance, they could hear their children playing, hear the sounds of the settlement settling in for the night, hear the eternal rhythm of the waves against the shore. This was enough, Quinton thought. This was more than enough. This was everything. And in that moment, sitting on the porch of the home they'd built together, with the woman he loved at his side and a future full of promise stretching out before them, Quinton Quade was happier than he'd ever dreamed possible. The orc girl who had once refused his guest bed and chosen the cold stone floor had become his wife, his partner, his heart. And together, they had created something beautiful from the ashes of two lives marked by war and loss. They had created a love that would endure, a family that would flourish, and a legacy that would prove, to anyone who cared to listen, that sometimes the most powerful thing in the world is simply choosing to see the person rather than the enemy, the possibility rather than the prejudice, the hope rather than the hate. And it all began on a stormy night when a wounded orc girl collapsed in his field, and Quinton Quade made the choice to help rather than harm, to offer shelter rather than violence, to open his heart rather than close it. That single choice had changed everything, had set them both on a path that led here, to this perfect moment of peace and contentment. Grishka squeezed his hand, and Quinton squeezed back, and in that simple gesture was all the love and trust and commitment they'd built over the years. They had started with nothing but each other in a world that told them their love was impossible. They had proven that world wrong, and they would continue to prove it wrong every single day for the rest of their lives. The end of their story was really just the beginning, the start of a legacy that would ripple outward from their small cabin by the sea. Their children would grow to become leaders in the settlement, and their children's children would spread across the Western territories, carrying with them the lesson that love transcends the boundaries of race and species and prejudice. But that night, sitting on their porch with the stars overhead and the sea whispering its eternal song, Quinton and Grishka didn't think about legacy or the future. They simply existed in the present moment, grateful for what they had and content in the knowledge that they had chosen each other, over and over again, through every challenge and triumph. And when they finally went inside to their warm bed, to hold each other through the night as they had done for so many years, they carried with them the certainty that they had found what truly mattered. Not wealth or status or approval from a world that didn't understand them, but simple, profound love. The kind of love that builds homes and raises families and changes hearts. The kind of love that starts when one person offers help to another, when kindness is given freely without expectation of reward, when two souls recognize in each other the possibility of something better than what they've known before. Grishka had once said that the cold stone floor was enough, that she would not take more than she needed. But Quinton had shown her that wanting more, deserving more, accepting more was not weakness or greed. It was simply being human, or being orc, or being whatever combination of both they had become through their love, and in the end, they had taken all they needed and all they wanted, and it had been exactly the right amount. Not too much, not too little, just enough to build a life worth living together.